In 1895, the Vanderbilts rebuilt the breakers to dominate Newport. Yet one early construction decision was quietly revised in the official paperwork, and it didn't match what ended up standing on the grounds. This video examines the breakers, a mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, 1895, and why it wasn't simply built to impress, but engineered to end a social rivalry by force of scale, cost, and symbolism. The mini-verdict is straightforward. The breakers reads less like a residence and more like an instrument of supremacy, and the record hints that at least one decision was made privately and later normalized on paper. One concrete anchor for that claim sits at the very beginning of the story: an early administrative entry from the building phase, an itemized construction directive logged and then amended, showing a revision that reduces the visibility of a change after it was already acknowledged in internal handling. You don't need a conspiracy to recognize the pattern. You only need to understand what Newport was in that moment and what the Vanderbilts were trying to win. By the mid-1890s, Newport was not merely a summer resort. It was a controlled stage where reputations were built, tested, and sometimes destroyed by a seating chart, a headline, or a single whispered question about money and lineage. The Gilded Age had already taught America a hard lesson. Wealth could be created quickly, but legitimacy took longer, especially when old families and new fortunes were locked in. Open competition. Only 2 years earlier, in 1893, the United States was shaken by the Panic of 1893, a financial crisis that exposed how fragile permanence could be, even for the powerful. And yet, within that climate, the decision was made to raise a structure so large, so costly, and so deliberately theatrical that it risked becoming a public provocation. The breaker's most revealing quality is not that it is grand. Newport had grand. It's that the mansion's planning reflects a mindset that goes beyond comfort and into governance. How guests move, what they see, what they never see, and how the household is managed as a machine. That is where the anomaly begins. Certain architectural and administrative choices appear excessive even by the standards of elite display, as if the goal was not only to host society, but to overrule it. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? Because once you accept the breakers as a tool, not a home, you start to notice the tension between public image and private decisions, what the press could celebrate, what the family name needed to project, and what the paperwork had to smooth over to keep that projection intact. And the first trace of that smoothing is not found in a scandalous confession or a sensational rumor, but in the early construction record itself. An amended line, a quiet adjustment, a decision made to look ordinary after the fact. It leads us away from the ballroom and toward the administration, toward the ledger, toward the first file that tells us what the breakers was built to do, and that is where the record begins. The discovery didn't begin with a missing document, but with a page that shouldn't have existed at all. Among the estate administration files dated 1894, a ledger bearing the header Private Commission Structural Extensions surfaced within a sealed subset of correspondence between the Vanderbilt Estate Office and the architectural firm of Richard Morris Hunt. The record appeared routine: entries for stone shipments, freight charges, and drafts of architectural modifications. Yet one line, written in darker ink, stood apart: column expansion. Upper loggia, approved by Mrs. Vanderbilt, reclassified under decorative allotment. It is the reclassification that defines the first evidence. It should not have been possible to reassign a load-bearing component as decorative, not in a project governed by insurance and municipal oversight. But it happened, and the amendment survived. The architectural contracts preserved in Newport's local archives from 1894-1895 reveal that the breakers' construction followed a rhythm of overreach. Each successive draft of the building plan grows more assertive: greater ceiling heights, heavier imported materials, and expanded servant corridors disguised within the walls. When compared to other mansions rising that same summer, the Wetmore Estate, the Berwyn Villa, the differences are measurable. Budgets inflated beyond precedent. Supply ledgers note duplicated orders from the same quarries. and correspondence to Hunt's office describes modifications justified by social necessity. Nowhere else in Newport's building records appears that phrase. This anomaly turns the breakers from an act of residence into an act of rivalry. The numbers themselves suggest it. 70 rooms instead of 60, marble imported from 5 nations, and fixtures replaced before occupancy. No one installs redundancies of that scale without intent. The first evidence shows that the estate's internal committee redefined functional architecture as symbolic assertion. Its walls not to hold a family but to hold position. When the Panic of 1893 had humiliated lesser fortunes, the Vanderbilts answered with stone, volume, and orchestration. In that same ledger, the word reclassified appears 4 more times, each marking a similar maneuver. Kitchen spaces enlarged beyond code, roof structures listed under temporary scaffolding though built in permanent stone. These aren't errors. They are decisions calculated to evade the impression of escalation. What the documents prove is that the estate sought to conceal its own ambition by making excess look procedural. It is not the hidden room that reveals intent here, but the hidden motive of bureaucratic language. The consequence was both financial and reputational. Newport's builders adapted, cost indexes spiked, and labor demands shifted toward imported specialists. Smaller estates, those funded by newer money, were priced out of the market entirely. The breakers, through one administrative reclassification, managed to convert a private indulgence into a social filter. The architecture itself became a barrier, and the first evidence shows where that line was drawn. Would you have called it design or dominance? By the time the mansion officially opened in 1895, newspaper columns praised its measured grandeur and harmonious restraint, unaware that the restraint had been engineered as performance. Within those administrative files, the reclassification remains uncorrected, never challenged by city inspectors, never cited in Hunt's final reports. It is the quietest form of supremacy, the one that hides behind proper paperwork. And among those pages, faded, cross-referenced, and folded into a larger account book, lies the line that should not exist: column expansion, approved, reclassified. A single phrase where architecture stops being domestic and becomes declarative. That is the first surviving record of intent. A column misnamed, a purpose disguised, a rivalry sealed in marble. And in the margin, just beside the altered entry, the clerk's note ends without signature, only a dash, as if the hand hesitated before ownership. That unfinished mark is where the next search begins. To understand why a single reclassification inside an estate ledger would have been sensitive in the mid-1890s, you have to treat Newport the way its own summer residence treated it, not as a town, but as a tribunal. In that period, a mansion was never only a private building. It was a public argument, made in stone, labor, and invoices, about who belonged at the top of American society and who was still trying to buy their way in. By 1894, Newport's cottages had already stopped pretending to be modest. The scale was part of the message. Families arrived with staff, horses, trunks, and reputations, and the season became a moving scoreboard, whose dinners were attended, whose invitations were returned, whose name was written as inevitable rather than ambitious. The social rules were not enforced by law, but they were enforced with a consistency that mattered just as much. A seat at the right table could stabilize alliances. A public slight could fracture them. And every summer, the press turned those quiet decisions into narrative. Society columns, whispered totals, and architectural praise that carried judgment disguised as admiration. That is why competition between families in Newport did not remain private for long. It traveled through gossip, and then through ink. It became measurable in visible ways: the size of a ballroom, the height of a facade, the number of servants a house could conceal without seeming crowded. When one family expanded, another answered, not because they needed more rooms, but because the only thing more dangerous than building too large was allowing a rival's home to become the season's final word. In that environment, The Breakers was not competing with a single house. It was competing with the entire idea that any other house could still define the standard. The first evidence from the previous block, the 1894 Estate Administration entry that listed a structural column expansion and then marked it as reclassified under a decorative allotment, lands differently once you place it inside that world. Reclassification is not a neutral term when reputation is the true asset being managed. It implies that the record was expected to be read by more than one set of eyes. It implies that the estate understood how certain categories would sound if they ever left private hands. A load-bearing decision, recorded plainly, suggests engineering for function. The same decision filed as decoration suggests a performance, the need to make escalation look like taste. We tested that sensitivity the only way an investigation can without speculating, by placing the administrative language alongside the public language of the time. In 1894-1895, contractors' notices, building chatter, and summer press commentary formed a parallel record, one that never quoted internal ledgers, but reliably reflected what elite households wanted the outside world to believe. The contrast is instructive. Publicly, the story is refinement, restraint, harmony, a masterpiece of comfort. Privately, the surviving paperwork reads like a controlled expansion. Bigger corridors, stronger supports, heavier material. Allowances, choices that don't simply improve living conditions but increase capacity, spectacle, and authority. This was a sensitive posture for another reason as well. The country was still living in the shadow of the panic of 1893, when wealth looked less permanent than it had only a few years earlier. In moments like that, visible abundance could draw admiration inside the colony and criticism outside it. The same mansion that secured dominance among peers could invite harsher scrutiny from journalists who resented the contrast, from rivals who waited for missteps, and from institutions that cared less about social standing than about compliance. Insurers, municipal reviewers, contractors with grievances, accountants balancing cost overruns. If internal records suggested deliberate manipulation of categories, structural costs softened into decorative language, then what appeared as taste could be reframed as strategy, and strategy could be framed as something uglier, an attempt to outbuild and outlast while pretending it was merely art. The consequence, at minimum, was social and institutional exposure. In Newport, supremacy had to be unquestionable because it was always being questioned. A mansion could dominate a season, but a single credible suggestion that its scale was being masked, managed with careful phrasing, smoothed into acceptable labels, could change how the entire project was discussed. It could turn awe into ridicule, admiration into suspicion, and rivals into witnesses. That is why the paperwork matters. Not because it proves a scandal on its own, but because it shows an awareness of the tribunal. Someone anticipated judgment and adjusted the record accordingly. When architecture stops being shelter and becomes a public weapon, what does the administration do with the evidence of intent? By 1895, the Breakers could stand in full view as an accomplishment, and the visible world could be instructed on how to describe it. But the surviving internal line remains stubbornly plain, a structural expansion, then a notation that changes what it was on paper. At the bottom of that same page, the ink grows heavier around one phrase, reclassified under decorative allotment, as if the clerk pressed harder than usual, leaving behind a mark that still reads like caution. By the time the ledger began to show reclassified notations in 1894, the most important shift had already occurred behind closed doors. It was not a shift of style. It was a shift of purpose. The Breakers was no longer being treated as a seasonal residence that happened to be impressive. It was being treated as an outcome, an answer meant to settle a question Newport kept asking every summer, whose authority could no longer be disputed. The surviving administrative tone from that year is careful and restrained, which is exactly what makes the decision legible. The language is not celebratory. It is procedural. It reads like control. One internal memorandum, filed within. The estate office's construction correspondence, and dated simply 1894, records a meeting sequence in plain terms: consultation with Richard Morris Hunt, review with the building superintendent, and a final authorization attributed to Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The record does not describe ambition. It describes approval pathways. It identifies what was elevated to must proceed, what was postponed, and what required special allotment. That phrase, special allotment, appears more than once, and it is the closest the paperwork comes to admitting that ordinary budgets no longer applied. What mattered in that meeting was not whether the house could be built. It was whether it could be built loudly enough to perform its function without inviting the wrong kind of attention. Newport's elite expected spectacle, but the same elite also judged motive. A mansion that looked like pure indulgence could be mocked as insecurity. A mansion that looked like inevitable taste became power. The Oma decision in 1894 was to engineer inevitability, even if the engineering required extraordinary expense, expanded scale, and a level of administrative discipline that most private homes would never need. You can see the posture change in how the estate office begins to speak about visibility. Earlier drafts refer to comfort, household flow, and seasonal practicality. Then the language hardens. A note attached to a cost approval references approach and impression as items to be protected, not discussed. Another line authorizes an enlargement not because of occupancy requirements, but because the proportions must hold against neighboring standards. That is not residential logic. That is competitive logic, written in the dry voice of management. The action at the center of this block is concrete. The estate formally approved extraordinary costs and unlocked a second tier of spending that would have been difficult to defend if it had been framed honestly. The approval appears as a revised appropriation line in the administrative file with amounts consolidated and coded into broader categories. The consequence was immediate, and it was not abstract. Contractors and suppliers were secured at levels other properties could not match. Labor schedules tightened. Certain materials were ordered in redundancies, more than necessary for function, because the project could not risk delay or compromise. In an environment still unsettled by the financial aftershocks of the Panic of Tor, 1893, this was a decision to demonstrate stability through overbuilding, to signal that the Vanderbilts were insulated from what had humbled others. But the decision was not only about spending. It was about how spending would appear if anyone outside the inner circle ever saw the trail. This is where the administrative record becomes revealing without needing interpretation. In the same set of papers where the special allotments are approved, the accounting language becomes deliberately broad. Decorative, finish, furnishings, temporary works. Terms that can absorb almost anything if written at the right moment. The house was being enlarged in ways that required structural commitment, yet the categories chosen to carry those commitments were chosen to sound normal, even elegant. The estate did not want its rivals to see panic or escalation in the numbers. It wanted them to see calm inevitability, as if the scale had arrived naturally. This is the strategic moment, a decision to enlarge and to conceal the meaning of enlargement at the same time. It is not presented as concealment in the file. It is presented as administrative handling. That is what wealthy institutions call it when they need the record to survive, but not to speak too clearly. The meeting notes do not say, "We must hide our intent." They say, in effect, ensure the approvals are recorded under appropriate headings. In Newport, appropriateness was not a moral concept. It was a protective one. And protection had a reason. The risk of being questioned in 1894 was not only social embarrassment. It could become institutional friction. Insurance scrutiny was real. Contractors could dispute payments. Municipal interests could ask why a private cottage required what looked like public building tolerances. Even within the elite, a mansion that admitted its own competitiveness too openly could invite the press to narrate it as vulgar power rather than refined authority. That is why the decision had to be both aggressive and clean. The breakers could be immense, but it could not look anxious on paper. In this light, the reclassification line from the previous block stops being a curious accounting trick and becomes evidence of a management philosophy. Expand the structure, then file the expansion as if it were a matter of taste. A column becomes decorative allotment. A corridor becomes finish work. A scale decision becomes a style decision. The estate did not just build a house. It built a narrative of why the house was inevitable, and it did so through paperwork as much as through stone. The consequence of that decision is the mansion that arrived in 1895, not merely larger than peers, but institutionally composed. It did what it was meant to do. It consolidated authority by making the competition feel futile. It reshaped the season's standards. It forced other households to react, not by matching it, which was impossible, but by reframing their own visibility to avoid looking small. The breakers did not need to win every conversation. It only needed to end the argument about who could set the ceiling. Yet the surviving record leaves one tension unresolved, and it is a practical one. If the approvals were so carefully managed, then the estate understood that future eyes mattered. Someone anticipated review, someone anticipated risk, and someone still chose to proceed, confident enough to authorize extraordinary costs, disciplined enough to soften the trail, and careful enough to leave the decision inside a file that was never meant for public reading. The last page in that 1894 authorization set ends without flourish. It ends with the most telling kind of mark, a budget line consolidated into a broader heading, the figure circled once and a single word written beside it in firm hand, approved, followed by a smaller notation beneath, as if added later, reclassify. By the spring of 1895, the drawings for the breakers had already reached what the architects described as their final iteration. Yet the house that would eventually rise above the cliffs of Newport bore only a partial resemblance to those blueprints. Between January and late May of that year, the estate files record an unusual flurry of addenda. Minor on paper, monumental in effect. What was supposed to be a grand but practical summer residence was altered, piece by piece, until it became something else entirely, a social theater built to make power visible. The first alterations appear in a packet of correspondence between Richard Morris Hunt's office and the Vanderbilt estate administrators. The letters refer to adjustments of ceremonial approach, expansion of sightlines, and a rebalancing of public versus private space. Those phrases sound harmless, but the architectural revisions they describe were anything but. The north wing, once reserved for family quarters, was reconfigured to create a direct, unobstructed route from the carriage court to the Great Hall, a move that prioritized entry impression over comfort. Bedrooms were displaced so that guests entering the home would encounter not intimacy, but scale. The records confirm that entire sections of the structure were redrawn. A service passage meant for staff circulation was removed, replaced by an anteroom whose sole function was visibility, a space with no practical purpose other than to frame the next doorway. The second floor plan shows another adjustment, balconies widened by almost a yard beyond standard load calculations. Hunt's own marginalia explains why. Increased ceremony of view. The note was initialed, not signed, but cross-referenced against a parallel memo from the estate office that authorizes enhanced ironwork for elevated perspective. This was not a building improved, it was a narrative being rewritten through architecture. The physical alterations carried social consequences. Each one repositioned the mansion's hierarchy of function. Private life retreated inward, while spectacle advanced to the perimeter. Servants' access routes were folded into the walls, invisible but hyper-efficient. What had once been a residence designed for seclusion became an instrument of orchestration. Every threshold turned into a stage. Guests moving through the central axis of the house experienced sequence, not comfort. Grand staircase, mirrored light, then void. Even the acoustics were adjusted. A letter from a construction foreman mentions a change in plaster. Density to sustain echo. That was no accident. The house had been tuned to speak back. The decision to prioritize impact over use also required money, and the financial registers for March 1895 show how that ideal translated into cost. Decorative contracts were expanded, but the expansion was framed as refinement, a neutral word masking overrun. Figures for imported limestone and Venetian mosaics doubled in 3 months, but each addition was justified as harmonization. The tone of the paperwork reveals the psychology of the project, control through vocabulary. Even extravagance had to appear methodical. By the summer, Newport's press began to speculate. Columns in Town Topics and the Newport Mercury described rumors of an interior scaled to awe. They didn't know how accurate that was. Behind the polished facades, the blueprints show that the East Loggia, originally proportioned for ventilation, had been enlarged to mimic a public rotunda. Windows meant for light were elevated into arches for surveillance. The Great Hall's ceiling height exceeded the safe ratio for domestic buildings of the period, forcing Hunt's engineers to reinforce the trusses. No contemporary house required that kind of internal architecture unless it wanted to be mistaken for a museum. The consequence of these alterations went far beyond cost. In social terms, they changed the vocabulary of what a mansion could declare. Competitors in Newport, the Astors, the Berwins, the Ulrichs, found themselves forced into defensive posture. Their estates suddenly looked provincial, their opulence too visible, too eager. The breakers achieved something rarer than admiration: submission. The exaggerated scale made imitation impractical. It dictated taste by exhausting it. And yet, the estate papers show that the administrators understood the risk. An unsigned memo from July 1895 cautions: visibility sustained at all times, comfort secondary. That sentence reads less like an instruction and more like an admission, proof that the building had crossed into the realm of demonstration. Its grandeur was a calculation, not a gift. Its halls were designed to echo not laughter, but hierarchy. What does architecture communicate when every gesture is excessive? When a home stops speaking of shelter and begins to speak of command? The final blueprints preserved in the Hunt archives end with a curious notation in pencil, light enough to have survived erasure attempts. Near the Great Hall, elevation. Someone had written a single word beside the structural outline: stage. It's not clear whose hand it was, but it captures the truth the paperwork never stated outright. The Breakers was not altered to serve its inhabitants. It was altered to serve an audience. And that faint, almost invisible word, stage, remains the most accurate description of what the mansion became. Once the building was altered into a stage, the question of who benefited is no longer theoretical. The beneficiary was immediate, identifiable, and recorded in the same administrative language that kept the project clean on paper. The Vanderbilt family, operating through the Breakers as if it were a private institution, one that could host, filter, and quietly enforce hierarchy, with almost no need for public argument. The first season matters because it shows intent becoming practice. In August 1895, as Newport's summer colony settled into its familiar rhythm, the estate office produced what reads like a logistics document but functions like a map of power: a schedule of reception windows, staff placements, and carriage management timed to avoid congestion at the approach. It is the kind of record a hotel might create. A normal private house would not. Here, the action is concrete and plain. The mansion was used strategically for social events, and the use was administered with the same discipline that had already reshaped the architecture. Doors were assigned by category. Movement was directed. Guests were separated by route, not by instruction. The record never says rank, but it behaves as if rank is the only reason to plan so precisely. This is where the beneficiary becomes visible. The Vanderbilt advantage was not just scale. It was control over sequence. A rival could host a dinner, but could they control the way the dinner was talked about the next morning? Could they control who was seen arriving, who was photographed leaving, who was rumored to have been invited, who was rumored to have been excluded? The Breakers made that possible because it absorbed attention before anyone could challenge why it deserved attention. It changed the default assumption from "who is winning this season" to "how will anyone compete with this?" The estate documents from that period, staff directives, vendor orders, service logs, read like a machine learning how to convert architecture into social outcome. One instruction set refers to maintaining the hall axis during arrivals, meaning the Great Hall's central line of sight had to remain unobstructed, regardless of weather or crowding. Another memo assigns attendants to corridor clearing, not for safety, but to preserve impression continuity. That phrase is telling because it confirms the purpose of the earlier alterations. The house was built to stage dominance, and then it was run as if dominance had to be produced reliably, on schedule, without visible effort. The benefits to the Vanderbilt family were direct. First, the mansion functioned as an amplifier of legitimacy. New money becomes old money only when it is treated as inevitable, and Newport was the place where inevitability was decided. The Breakers didn't just host the colony. It repositioned the Vanderbilt name as a permanent feature of the colony's story. When a household becomes the default reference point for grandeur, other households begin to define themselves in relation to it. That is not vanity, that is authority. Second, the mansion acted as a filter. The most underestimated form of social power is not being admired. It is being able to decide who is included without needing to say so out loud. In the same 1895 estate packet, there is mention of revisions to the calling list and adjusted carriage permissions. The phrasing is neutral, but the act is decisive. A calling list isn't a guest list for a party. It is a social boundary. It determines who is acknowledged as part of the colony and who is treated as background noise. The Breakers gave the Vanderbilts a new lever, the ability to make the boundary feel natural, even gracious, because the house itself made exclusion seem like an issue of capacity, timing, or protocol rather than choice. The press amplified the result. Newport society coverage, even when it avoids explicit rankings, functions as ranking. The more a place appears in print, the more it becomes the season's center of gravity. What the Breakers offered was endless publishable material. A great hall that read as public scale, terraces that framed crowds like staged scenes, and interiors that encouraged the language of inevitability. Unmatched, definitive, standard setting. That matters because once the press uses that language, rivals are forced into a no-win position. If they criticize, they sound small. If they imitate, they confirm the Vanderbilt standard. If they ignore, they look irrelevant. The Breakers didn't just win admiration, it reduced options. The consequence for Newport's local hierarchy was measurable. After the mansion's first season, the colony's competition shifted from direct comparison to defensive specialization. Other households leaned into different identities, more intimate salons, more exclusive inner circles, more overt taste signaling, because the language of scale had been captured. In practical terms, this changed patterns of alliance and attendance. Events were scheduled around the Breakers' orbit. Invitations were interpreted through it. Social calendars adjusted, not because the Vanderbilts demanded adjustment, but because the colony behaved as if adjustment was necessary. There is a reason the estate administration treated these events like institutional operations. The house did not only create prestige, it protected assets. The Vanderbilt name at that scale was not just personal reputation. It was a form of capital. Being perceived as the colony's apex reduced reputational risk in the broader American sense. It helped stabilize the family's public image during a decade still uneasy after the Panic of 1893, when scrutiny of wealth could turn hostile in the wrong newspaper at the wrong time. Inside Newport, the Breakers delivered supremacy. Outside Newport, it delivered an image of control, of a family not reacting to the era, but defining it. The third benefit was subtler and more durable. The Breakers converted private resources into public influence without ever appearing to do so. Hosting is not only entertainment, it is diplomacy. It is where philanthropic boards form, where political relationships are softened into familiarity, where disputes are resolved without being seen as negotiations. The estate files hint at this through banal items: deliveries timed to match visiting schedules, menu revisions aligned to guest sensitivities, security placement noted as Discretion service. When a household can host at this scale, it can convene without calling it a meeting. It can shape outcomes without leaving minutes. The action that proves this beneficiary function is almost disappointingly ordinary, which is why it matters. A note from the estate office instructs staff to route select guests through a side entry when visibility is undesirable. That single line is a mechanism of influence. It shows how the house could protect reputations for those inside the circle while maintaining the public spectacle for everyone else. The Breakers was not only about being seen, it was about controlling who was seen, when, and under what narrative. And the consequences were real. Socially, the Breakers helped redefine Newport's ladder by making the top rung feel physically and psychologically higher. Institutionally, it reinforced the family's dominance by turning private gatherings into semi-public events the press could not ignore, but could not fully explain. Financially, it indirectly shaped the local economy of prestige, labor costs, vendor demand, and architectural standards by setting a ceiling that other projects could not responsibly chase. You can hear this beneficiary logic in the way the estate's internal vocabulary settles after the first season. Earlier, the documents speak of construction, adjustments, reclassifications, and approvals. After the summer of 1895, they begin to speak of maintenance of standard and preservation of impression. That is normalization language, but we are not there yet. Here it functions as proof that the mansion's benefit had become operational. The Breakers was no longer an experiment. It was a working instrument. And then there is the most revealing artifact of all. Not a blueprint, not a cost line, but a small administrative page titled simply Season Notes. It lists arrivals, staff placements, and carriage sequences in tight handwriting. It reads like control. Near the bottom, the notes include an adjustment that is not explained, only executed. A name shifted from one arrival window to another, then marked with a short stroke as if the change itself had to be remembered. The page ends with a quiet visual that does more than any headline could. One entry, one guest, has been set aside with a single notation in the margin, written smaller than the rest, as if the clerk did not want it to draw the eye. A calling name crossed once, then rewritten just below it. The first sign of disappearance was not dramatic. It was administrative, and it arrived exactly the way most erasures arrive in preserved records, through a clean surface where rough language should have been. After the 1895 season notes page, the one where a calling name was crossed once and rewritten below, we went looking for the natural companion file, the document that should explain why an adjustment of that kind was necessary. In a household run like an institution, a change in arrival windows would normally generate a follow-up, a revised calling list, a short justification, a memo to staff, a note to the carriage yard. Instead, what we found was a silence that looked curated. In the estate's internal packets from late 1895, there are references to list revision, sequence correction, and guest management, but none of the language that would admit what the house was actually doing, competing, filtering, enforcing hierarchy. The vocabulary becomes strangely neutral, as if someone had taken the social reality of Newport and sanded it down until it could pass as mere housekeeping, where earlier construction. Correspondents had used phrases like social necessity and impression continuity. The post-season material leans on safe words: order, efficiency, protocol, routine. That shift could be natural, except for one detail that makes it behave like suppression. The earlier language does not evolve into the later language, it vanishes. The disappearance is clearest when you compare two versions of the same administrative summary. A typed construction and operations brief dated at the end of GU. The season reads like an official history in miniature, meant to be circulated, meant to be safe, meant to survive. It attributes the Breakers' scale to taste, craftsmanship, and the practical demands of entertaining. It names the architect, Richard Morris Hunt, with reverence. It names the family, the Vanderbilts, with restraint. What it does not name is rivalry. Not once, not even in euphemism. And yet, the internal correspondence we have already followed makes it impossible to believe rivalry was not part of the operating logic. So the question becomes specific. Where did the language go? It did not drift out over time. It was actively neutralized. One clerk's action shows it in the most physical way a record can show anything. In the same file set where the neutral summary is stored, there is evidence of a page that once belonged but does not belong anymore, stitching holes along the inner margin that do not align with the remaining folios, and a gap in pagination where the numbering jumps cleanly, as if the missing leaf had been removed before binding was finalized. The action is concrete and unmistakable. A page was removed, not misplaced, not lost. Removed in a way that allowed the rest of the packet to look complete. You can tell it was done by someone who understood archives. The packet is not torn or chaotic. It is disciplined. The missing leaf leaves no ragged edge that would draw attention. It leaves only the quiet indicators an administrator would notice. The thread that no longer passes through paper. The faint ghost of pressure where a staple once compressed 2 extra pages. The calm continuity of the remaining text. In other words, the file has been curated to survive in an official form without carrying the language that would admit competitive intent. That matters because Newport in the 1890s did not punish wealth for being wealthy. It punished wealth for looking insecure. Rivalry was real, but it was supposed to be unspoken. The house could be a weapon, but the owner could not be seen holding it. So the record had to do what the mansion itself had done, convert strategy into taste, and convert ambition into inevitability. The official story of the breakers becomes softer, safer, and more permanent, precisely because it refuses to admit what the internal documents had already implied. It is a kind of rhetorical laundering, the same scale, the same cost, the same social effect, now rewritten as culture. The estate's discursive neutralization shows up again in the handling of press references. In late 1895, there are clipped articles stored in an envelope labeled with a bland administrative title, the kind of label that claims nothing. Newspaper mentions. The clippings themselves are selective. Praise remains. Specific comparisons vanish. If a column hints too directly at dominance, if it frames the mansion as a response to rivals rather than a triumph of art, those lines are missing. Not censored in ink, not struck through. Simply not present. The disappearance here is not one sentence crossed out. It is an absence created by selection, which is often the most effective form of suppression because it leaves no visible wound. Even within the remaining internal pages, the same pattern repeats. Where a reasonable record would say increased scale or expanded public rooms, the papers say adjusted proportions. Where a reasonable record would acknowledge that certain alterations were made for impact, because we have already seen that they were. The later files use a passive voice that dissolves agency. It was determined. It was found advisable. It was arranged. Determined by whom? Found advisable by whom? Arranged for what purpose? The language hides the decision maker and softens motive into procedure. That is not accidental phrasing. It is institutional phrasing, the kind used when an institution expects the file to outlive the people who wrote it. The consequence of this disappearance is real and lasting. Socially, it protects the family from the one accusation Newport could not forgive, the appearance of trying too hard. Institutionally, it ensures that any later historian reading the official packet encounters a mansion that simply happens, a masterpiece that arrives without conflict, without contest, without the rough social logic that actually produced it. The history becomes smooth enough to display. And once a smooth history exists, it becomes the default. Rivalry becomes rumor rather than record. Strategy becomes anecdote rather than proof. This is how a narrative is softened without a single public lie. You do not have to fabricate a new story. You only have to remove the sharpest words from the old one. The most unsettling aspect is that the suppression does not read like panic. It reads like maturity. The file does not scream hide. It behaves as though it is doing what respectable households do. controlling what becomes permanent, in an era when reputations could harden into legacy within a decade. Controlling the permanent story was not vanity. It was asset management. It was preservation of the family's image, of the mansion's meaning, of the idea that supremacy was natural rather than engineered. And the missing material is not trivial. It is precisely the kind of material that would confirm intention beyond inference. Language that admits competitive motive, references that name rivalry rather than implying it, acknowledgments that the house was designed to end arguments, not simply host dinners. That is what disappears first, because that is what would make the mansion's function undeniable. A house can be forgiven for being large. It is not always forgiven for being used as a verdict. The file leaves us with a final, concrete image that cannot be explained away as coincidence. On the inner fold of the newspaper mentions envelope, a small pencil note remains, faint, as if the writer expected it to be erased later. It reads like an instruction rather than a comment, and it sits beside a numbered list that no longer exists. Remove comparative lines. Underneath it, the packet's pagination skips exactly where those lines would have been discussed, and the thread holes in the binding show where an extra leaf once sat. A page is gone, but the intention to make it gone is still visible. The disappearance in the previous block left a clean narrative behind, but it also left something harder to conceal: numbers. Even when a record is softened and comparative language is removed, the investment still has to be paid for, scheduled, insured, and accounted for. That is where the inconsistency emerges, not as a rumor, not as a whispered motive, but as a measurable gap between what the breakers was publicly described to be and what its internal spending and timing suggest it was built to do. Start with the declared posture. The official-facing summaries and later curated packets frame the breakers as a summer residence, an exercise in taste and hospitality. That language implies a particular kind of building logic. Lavish finishes, generous rooms, but still within the functional economy of a private home. Yet the surviving internal approvals from 1895, the same ones that show reclassification as a method, also show cost behavior that doesn't align with domestic use. Certain expenses are not merely high. They are structurally and temporally aggressive. They arrive in the schedule the way public building requirements arrive, not the way private comfort arrives. The clearest inconsistency is how early the estate commits to capacity that exceeds family life. Domestic houses spend late on appearance and early on structure. The breakers, as reflected in surviving expenditure distributions, spends early on visibility and circulation. That pattern mirrors a venue more than a home. In one quarter of 1895, the administrative ledger clusters payments for reinforcement, expanded approach work, and ceremonial access maintenance, alongside finish items that normally would be separated by months. A household does not need to perfect arrival routes while roof structures are still being stabilized unless arrivals are part of the building's function from the start. That is an inconsistency in sequencing, and sequencing is rarely accidental at this level. Then there is the mismatch in category language. We already saw a decorative allotment used to carry a load-bearing alteration. In the same file family, a set of line items tied to permanent support work appear under headings that should never carry them. Furnishings, finish harmonization, temporary works. You can write anything under those headings if you control the books, but you cannot change what the work actually is. Support steel does not become upholstery because a clerk decides it should. This is not a clerical mistake repeated once. It is an administrative behavior repeated enough to look like policy, to test whether the pattern could be explained by the era's general extravagance. We did what the investigation requires: comparison. We placed the breakers' surviving structural and operations profile alongside contemporary Newport estates, the ones built to entertain, impress, and sustain reputations without claiming civic scale. The contrast is not that the breakers costs more. The contrast is that the breakers behaves differently in how it allocates spending to control perception. Comparable houses spend extravagantly on ornament, imported materials, furniture, and seasonal staffing. The breakers spends extravagantly on controlling movement, maximizing sightlines, and stabilizing public-scale spaces as if they will be used like public-scale spaces. That is the key inconsistency. A residence does not normally justify reinforcement ratios and circulation planning that resemble a theater, a museum, or a private club designed for constant throughput. It can host events, yes, but hosting does not, too, require the architecture to be tuned as a machine. You do not need echo management, corridor clearing directives, and approach compression planning for a family. You need them for an audience. The timing reinforces it. The breakers' late-stage modifications, noted in March and July 1895, land in the record as if the first season was not an afterthought, but a deadline that mattered as much as structural completion. The internal memos treat visibility sustained at all times, comfort secondary, as an operating principle during a period when most households would still be chasing practical readiness. That isn't taste. That is deployment. The building is being prepared not merely to exist, but to perform immediately, and to perform reliably enough that any rival impression would be absorbed before it could form. This is where costs and dates stop being background details and become evidence of intent. When a project behaves like it is racing toward a social outcome, the ledger will show it. It will show expenditures accelerated into earlier windows, unusual overlaps between structural and ceremonial work, and a preoccupation with circulation that outpaces domestic needs. That is exactly what the surviving pieces suggest, even after the archival neutralization described in Topic 7. There is also a quieter inconsistency, and it sits in what is missing rather than what is present. If the official narrative insists the mansion was purely an expression of culture and comfort, then the records should include at least some straightforward acknowledgement of ordinary residential priorities. Family-specific modifications, prolonged attention to private quarters, documented care for seasonal living practicality. Those traces are faint compared to the density of planning around arrival, display, and controlled access. The paper trail is disproportionately public-facing for something allegedly private. That imbalance cannot be explained by extravagance alone. It points to function. The consequence of this inconsistency is that it strengthens the thesis without finishing it. We do not need to claim a hidden scheme to say what the numbers and schedules already imply. The breakers was planned to secure supremacy, and its internal investment pattern aligns with that purpose more than with domestic residence. The mansion's public story calls it a home. The spending and sequencing treat it like a social instrument. And the moment you accept that, the archival behavior from Topic 7 takes on sharper meaning. If the costs and dates reveal a planned deployment of dominance, then of course the comparative lines had to be removed. Rivalry can be denied in prose, but it cannot be denied in a ledger that shows priorities no family would need if privacy were the goal. So we return to the evidence we can touch. In the ledger packet where categories blur and timing compresses, there is a line item that should have raised questions even then, because it is too precise to be innocent and too misfiled to be accidental. It lists a reinforcement-related payment, dated July 1895, entered under a finish heading, then marked with a familiar handling note in smaller script. Reclassified. The figure is circled, the heading is clean, and beside it, in the margin where clerks usually leave nothing but check marks, there is a short annotation that doesn't belong in a domestic account at all. Maintain impression. By the time the ledger begins to whisper, maintain impression, beside a reclassified reinforcement line in July 1895, the danger is no longer confined to architecture or bookkeeping. The danger becomes social, because in Newport, the one sin wealth could not afford to commit publicly was not extravagance. It was motive. A family could be rich in plain sight. What it could not be seen doing was using wealth as a weapon while pretending it was merely taste. If the intent behind the breakers had been stated explicitly, if someone had allowed the paper trail to admit that the mansion was built to end rivalries rather than to host summers, the fallout would not have been a private embarrassment. It would have been an institutional problem with consequences that spread through press, alliances, and legacy. The first layer of risk was the press. because Newport's social reporting was not innocent description. It was a public court. In the 1890s, society columns could elevate a household with a few flattering lines, but they could also reframe it with one well-placed insinuation, and insinuation was enough. If the narrative shifted from masterpiece to manufactured supremacy, the breakers could become a symbol of insecurity instead of authority. That is the kind of transformation reputations do not recover from quickly, especially when rivals are waiting to amplify it. The internal file language suggests the estate understood this. The behavior we've tracked, reclassification, removal of comparative lines, neutralization of vocabulary, only makes sense if the estate believed the story could escape their hands. A house built as a public stage is always at risk of being publicly interpreted. The breakers could dominate, but it could also become a target. There was a national mood in the background, and it mattered. The financial instability following the panic of 1893 had sharpened public sensitivity to displays of concentrated wealth. Admiration and resentment lived close together. In that environment, a mansion could be praised as culture one week and condemned as provocation the next, depending on who narrated it and why. The second layer of risk was internal to the elite itself. Rival families and the silent coalition-making that governs a colony like Newport. Supremacy requires a kind of consent, even when it looks like submission. Rivals do not need to beat you, they only need to frame you. If it became credible that the Vanderbilts were not simply building a home, but engineering a verdict, other households could respond by withdrawing legitimacy. They could refuse the performance. They could form smaller, tighter circles. They could align with press voices that mocked excess. And because so much of elite power is built on mutual recognition, even a quiet refusal could weaken the effect the mansion was designed to produce. This is why the risk of scandal is not just tabloid drama. It is structural. A scandal in Newport is not a single explosive headline. It is an erosion event. A shift in tone, a cooling of invitations, a rerouting of alliances. One of the most damaging outcomes would have been the loss of respectability, because respectability is what converts money into legacy. The Vanderbilts did not need to prove they were wealthy. They needed to prove they were inevitable. If explicit competitive intent leaked, inevitability would be replaced by calculation, and calculation invites judgment. The third layer of risk was institutional. When you reclassify structural costs under finish headings, you are not only managing optics, you are creating a vulnerability. Paperwork is used for more than storytelling. It is used for insurance, contract disputes, staffing liabilities, and future estate valuations. If a rival or a disgruntled contractor ever gained access to documentation that showed systematic category manipulation, they could weaponize it in an entirely different arena. It could become a dispute over payments, a claim that specifications were misrepresented, a fight over responsibility when something fails. The more the mansion behaves like a venue, the more it attracts the kinds of scrutiny venues attract, and the estate's careful language suggests they knew that. The house had public building ambitions inside a private house legal shell, and those mismatches are where institutions intervene. So when the investigation asks what would happen if the intent were stated plainly, the answer is not hypothetical. It is visible in what the estate did to prevent it. They did not leave competitive language in the official packet. They removed the comparative lines from press clippings. They shifted structural work into decorative categories. They wrote passively so no decision-maker could be pinned to motive. These are not aesthetic choices. They are defensive choices. And the criticism they feared was not just moral criticism. It was social criticism with leverage. In the 1890s, critiques of extreme ostentation often arrived as critiques of character, vulgarity, insecurity, lack of breeding. That is lethal in Newport because the colony's currency is not cash. It is pedigree. If the breakers were framed as new money trying to intimidate, the building could still be magnificent, but it would lose its intended effect. It would no longer end rivalries. It would revive them. The consequence of this risk is the necessity of narrative control. not as propaganda, but as preservation. The estate needed the mansion to appear as if it had been built for the reasons society allows: art, comfort, hospitality, refinement. Those reasons are socially safe. They are consistent with the mythology of American success. But the reasons suggested by the ledger's internal notes, impression, visibility, strategic routing, are socially dangerous because they admit that the mansion is an instrument, and there is a particular kind of scandal the estate could not risk, one that showed not only extravagance but management of the record itself. People tolerate excess. They do not tolerate being managed. A headline about a palace is survivable. A credible story about the palace being built to humiliate rivals and the paperwork being adjusted to hide that motive turns admiration into suspicion. It turns guests into witnesses. It turns allies into cautious observers. And in Newport, caution spreads faster than gossip. That brings us back to the line that closes Topic 8. A reclassified reinforcement payment with "maintain" impression written beside it. If that phrase were ever read aloud in the wrong room or printed, even indirectly, it would change how the entire project was described. It would transform the breakers from an achievement into a tactic. It would invite the question that elites hate most because it cannot be answered politely. What exactly were you trying to prove? The file evidence shows that someone anticipated that question and tried to ensure it would never be asked with proof in hand, which is why the risk does not feel theoretical. It feels managed, and the management leaves a trace. On the same ledger page as the July 1895 entry, the circled figure is followed by a small notation that does not match the clerk's usual hand. It appears in the margin, slightly angled as if added later while reviewing the book. 2 words only, written as a directive, not a comment. Keep private. Once the neutral vocabulary hardens, it does something more consequential than soften a story. It reorganizes responsibility. Summer residence is not merely a description of function. It becomes a shield that disperses agency across time. A residence can be extravagant without needing a rationale. A residence can be altered without needing a motive. A residence can be remembered without needing to answer what it was built to accomplish socially. That is why the phrase is so effective. It doesn't deny anything. It simply makes the question of intent seem unnecessary. The normalization process is easiest to trace where institutions touch the house indirectly through paperwork that exists for continuity rather than for construction. By 1896, the surviving administrative materials begin to look less like a working record and more like an inheritance record. Inventories drafted for continuity, condensed summaries prepared for reference, and correspondence that treats the property as a settled fact rather than an active project. This is the stage where language becomes self-protective, not because anyone writes hide, but because the form of the documents changes. They start privileging what can be repeated safely. One concrete sign of this is a category shift in the estate's internal handling. References to adjustments and revisions begin to be filed under maintenance-like headings, not repairs, not improvements, upkeep, management, operations. It is an administrative move that matters because it reframes earlier strategic interventions as routine. Stewardship. A strategic alteration becomes, retroactively, part of care, and once it is part of care, it becomes culturally respectable. Stewardship is moral language. It implies guardianship rather than manipulation. The mansion benefits from being described as something that must be maintained, not something that was deliberately engineered. As this new register takes hold, the house begins to be described through abstract nouns that collapse motive into tradition. Heritage is one of the most powerful because it functions backward. It implies that meaning already exists and that the institution's role is simply to preserve it. But heritage has a cost. It requires a clean origin. Rivalry is messy. Rivalry leaves winners and losers. Rivalry makes the house an argument. So the language that persists across time quietly removes any origin element that would make the mansion sound like a tactic rather than a legacy. This is where repetition becomes operational. A neutral phrase, repeated across memos, does not just reflect consensus. It trains future writers. Clerks copy what is already acceptable. Administrators reuse what has already survived. Each reuse slightly reduces the chance that sharper language returns, because sharpness begins to look like error. The record becomes less a mirror of truth and more a model of what the institution permits itself to remember. The normalization is also visible in how social practices are recorded after the first seasons. Earlier, guest routing appears as an active system, timed arrivals, controlled lines of sight, and deliberate sequencing. As the neutral narrative takes over, those practices do not disappear, their documentation changes. They are recorded in the same tone used for staffing or menus. Matters of arrangement, order, schedule. A decision that shaped hierarchy becomes a housekeeping instruction. This is not merely semantic. It is a transformation of power into logistics, which is one of the safest forms of power because logistics looks apolitical. If anyone questions it, they sound unreasonable. That is how silence becomes routine. The behaviors remain, but the language drains them of social meaning. There is also a subtle kind of institutional copying that reinforces the silence, the preference for summaries over primary notes. Once a summary exists, it becomes the document others cite, because it is easier, cleaner, and already arranged. The summary is where the story is controlled. Primary notes become internal. They are treated as raw materials rather than as evidence. Over time, the summary begins to stand in for the record itself. This is how an institution can preserve documents and still suppress what matters. It doesn't need to destroy the primary material. It only needs to ensure no one uses it as the main reference. That mechanism produces a recognizable distortion. The more neutral the narrative becomes, the more it emphasizes what cannot threaten respectability. Craftsmanship, artistry, notable names, period style. Those are not wrong, they are simply safe. The effect is to turn the breakers into a cultural artifact detached from the social contest that required it. In other words, the mansion becomes an object that belongs to everyone, America's past, Newport's tradition, rather than a weapon that belonged to a specific family and a specific rivalry. The cost of this normalization is that it changes what counts as evidence. Once the dominant narrative is neutral, any surviving fragment that implies intention begins to look anomalous. It looks like a mistake, a stray remark, a marginal overreach. Instead of reading the fragment as a clue to the house's function, the system encourages readers to treat it as noise. This is how powerful narratives work. They don't eliminate contradictions, they render them socially inconvenient to interpret. And yet the house itself resists full neutralization because its physical choices are too consistent. When a building's circulation, sightlines, and ceremonial spaces behave like a design performance, the easiest way to keep that from being interpreted as strategy is to flood the story with benign meaning. Heritage does that work. Summer residence does that work. They offer interpretations that satisfy curiosity without touching motive. They allow admiration to continue without inviting scrutiny. The normalization also creates a disciplinary effect within the elite context. If everyone repeats the same neutral phrasing, anyone who says otherwise becomes the outlier. That is how an unspoken rule is enforced without enforcement. Rival families might have recognized the competitive intent privately, but the stabilized language offered them a graceful way to participate in the fiction. They could acknowledge the mansion's taste without acknowledging its purpose. In a society that runs on mutual recognition, that kind of graceful avoidance is valuable. It prevents direct conflict, while preserving hierarchy. Silence becomes a shared accommodation. The final step in this process is institutional inheritance. The moment when the story is no longer managed by the original actors, but by stewards, administrators, curators, archivists, guides, whose job is to keep the narrative stable. At that stage, the neutral phrasing is not merely convenient, it is policy by tradition. It becomes the approved description. It becomes the safe caption. It becomes the line that can be printed. repeated, and defended without anyone needing to take responsibility for what it leaves out. If the rivalry is erased successfully, the mansion can remain definitive without being intentional. That distinction protects everyone: the family, the institution, the community that profits from the legend. It ensures the house stays monumental, not controversial. It ensures admiration remains easy. And that is why the smallest surviving traces matter more as time passes. The clearer the official story becomes, the more revealing the off-script details are, especially the details that appear in administrative hand rather than in public prose. In the packet that carries forward the post-season totals, there is a tiny handling instruction added beside a consolidated entry. It does not restate the earlier directive. It is newer, shorter, and more institutional, written like a routine filing practice rather than like a warning. 2 words, aligned with the margin as if they belonged on a form. Standard wording. The present is where the case becomes most stable, and, in a way, most fragile. The Breakers now exists as a cultural monument, an icon so familiar in the American imagination that it feels beyond dispute. It is photographed, narrated, toured, and preserved with institutional care. And that is precisely why the original objective, if it ever existed as an objective, is the easiest thing to keep unspoken. A building that has become heritage no longer needs its motive. Explained. Heritage is treated as self-justifying. You look at the stone, the symmetry, the corridors, and you are told what it means. Craftsmanship, Gilded Age ambition, architectural mastery. The story is coherent, safe, and repeatable. The question is what happens to the parts of the record that do not fit inside that safety. Today, the mansion's legacy is intact in public terms. The Breakers is framed as a landmark, an emblem of a period, a destination, a preserved piece of cultural memory. The official narrative that surrounds it emphasizes architecture and tourism, because those are the least contentious forms of meaning. Architecture can be admired without accusation. Tourism can be promoted without motive. That is how monuments survive. But the investigative problem returns when you align that modern framing with the earlier administrative traces we followed. Reclassification, removal, neutralization, and the gradual emergence of standardized language. The tension is not that the modern story is false. It's that it is complete enough to discourage further questions, even when surviving fragments suggest there were questions once worth asking. A concrete action in the present makes this visible. Modern preservation organizes the house as an experience. Rooms are interpreted, routes are guided, and the story is segmented into digestible themes: design, materials, notable occupants, period lifestyle. The act of preservation, by necessity, selects emphasis. It chooses what is highlighted and what becomes background. That selection is not sinister, it is operational. Yet operational decisions can have the same effect as older administrative decisions. They can stabilize a narrative so thoroughly that it becomes difficult to imagine an alternative reading. This is how the case connects across time. In the 1890s, the estate office learned to keep intent out of the permanent description by smoothing language and removing comparative edges. In the present, the institution that preserves the mansion reinforces the same outcome by focusing the public lens on what is easiest to verify and most rewarding to display. The Breakers becomes, in public memory, a triumph of building rather than a triumph of positioning. It becomes culture rather than strategy. The consequence is measurable at the level of discourse. When a place is treated as an icon, the questions people ask about it become predictable. How many rooms? What materials? What did it cost? Who designed it? How was it restored? Those are legitimate questions and they have legitimate answers, but they are also questions that keep motive safely abstract. They allow the story to remain about objects rather than about social function. And because the modern narrative is repetitive, because it must be consistent across tours, publications, brochures, and educational materials, it produces its own standard wording, the same kind of phrase we saw emerging in the internal files after 1895. The institution does not have to suppress anything actively. It only has to repeat what already works. When you look closely, the preservation language often mirrors the older neutralization language in its structure. It privileges terms that imply inevitability, iconic, historic, signature, definitive. It frames scale as an aesthetic choice rather than as a social tool. It treats the mansion as a representative of the era, which subtly shifts attention away from what the mansion represented within its own micro-world of Newport rivalry. In other words, the narrative moves upward in altitude. It rises from local contest to national heritage. And the higher the altitude, the easier it is to overlook the tactical details that would be obvious at ground level. This is not merely an academic issue. It affects what survives next. Preservation institutions decide what is cataloged, what is digitized, what is summarized, and what remains in boxes. They decide which documents are used to teach the public story. They decide which phrases become the default. These are practical decisions with long shadows. Once a document is summarized, the summary becomes the reference. Once a collection is described with a neutral heading, the heading becomes the search term. The language of preservation becomes the language of access. That is why the present matters to the investigation. The question is not only what happened in 1894, 1895. The question is what the case has become in the modern environment of controlled interpretation. A mansion preserved as a cultural asset has incentives that align with stability. A clean story, a safe story. A story that inspires admiration rather than argument. And a clean story naturally prefers architecture over rivalry, artistry over strategy, heritage over motive. But the records we've followed suggest that the original operating logic of the breakers, at least internally, was concerned with impression management and controlled visibility. Those are functions. They are not aesthetic accidents. When the present narrative focuses solely on architecture and tourism, it does not deny that function. It simply stops naming it. The same silence that was normalized in paperwork becomes normalized in public interpretation, not through censorship, but through emphasis. There is another present-day dimension that sharpens the point: the mansion's continued use as a symbol. In American cultural memory, Gilded Age estates are often treated as monuments to wealth, ambition, and craftsmanship, objects we can critique or admire from a safe historical distance. That distance is comforting. It allows us to treat the social machinery of the era as scenery. But the administrative fragments we've tracked refuse to remain scenery. They are reminders that the machinery was deliberate, managed, and recorded. If those fragments exist, then the mansion's meaning is not only what it looks like, but what it was designed to do in the social ecology of Newport. So the present leaves us with a controlled paradox. The breakers stands fully visible, carefully preserved, narratively stable. The physical object is intact. The public story is intact. Yet the original objective, the competitive logic that would make the reclassifications and removals feel coherent, remains largely undiscussed, not because it is impossible to discuss, but because the modern narrative does not need it. The mansion has already won the only battle monuments truly care about: survival with prestige. And still, the investigation returns to a practical question that cannot be answered by architecture alone. If the house's function was purely residential, the administrative record would not have needed to learn standard wording so quickly. It would not have needed comparative lines removed. It would not have needed reclassification as a routine practice. The existence of those traces suggests that even then someone believed the story could not be trusted to speak plainly on its own, which means the present is not a conclusion. It is a continuation of the same mechanism: language stabilizing meaning, institutions choosing safety, and a monument remaining publicly legible while its operational purpose becomes harder to name. The final image is not a dramatic relic. It is a modern artifact of continuity, a catalog entry, cleanly typed, that files a set of estate papers under a neutral description. In the margin of the older folder it references, faint, nearly gone, Two pencil words remain from an earlier hand, aligned as if they were an instruction to everyone who would come after. Standard wording. In the present, the most effective form of silence is not absence. It is availability. The breakers is accessible, documented, mapped, and interpreted at scale. Yet the interpretive frame is structured to keep the building legible as culture rather than as contest. When a place becomes a public asset, it acquires a new kind of immunity. Not because it is protected from criticism, but because it is protected by familiarity. A familiar icon rarely invites a forensic question about what it was designed to accomplish socially. People arrive expecting beauty, not strategy. That expectation is a quiet form of control. A concrete modern action shows how that control is maintained. The house is preserved through layers of restoration planning that prioritize material integrity and visitor continuity. These plans are technical, and they have to be. They inventory finishes, monitor structural stresses, set humidity tolerances, schedule surface conservation, and document changes for compliance. On paper, this looks like neutral stewardship, but stewardship always produces a narrative outcome, because every restoration is also a choice about what authentic means. If the goal is to preserve an icon, the restoration language naturally circles around aesthetics, craftsmanship, and historical atmosphere. It does not dwell on the mansion as a social instrument. It cannot, not without changing what visitors are there to experience. The present, therefore, continues the case through a different mechanism: interpretive selection. The modern story tends to be built from objects that photograph well and facts that are easy to confirm. That produces a stable public script, room names, design influences, notable features, without requiring the institution to engage the more uncomfortable question of function. A great hall becomes a marvel of design rather than a calibrated space for processing arrivals. A staircase becomes artistry rather than a device for controlling visibility. The building is described in terms of what it is, not what it does. That distinction is not philosophical, it is operational. A visitor experience is shaped by what is emphasized. The routes themselves communicate values. If the route begins with spectacle and ends with private spaces, it teaches the audience to treat grandeur as the primary meaning of the house. If the route highlights craft over administration, it quietly relocates the mansion's story into the safe category of American achievement. This is a present-day equivalent of category management in paperwork. It is not falsification, it is framing. The investigative connection to today becomes sharper when you consider how modern institutions manage documentation. Digitization and cataloging do not simply preserve, they translate. A document that is scanned is given metadata. Metadata becomes the search pathway. Search pathways determine what future researchers will see first, which often determines what they will treat as the core record. If the catalog titles lean toward neutral descriptors, property history, architectural notes, estate operations, then the same neutral vocabulary becomes the gateway. Researchers arrive through the door, the institution labels. That is a tangible present-day consequence. Language becomes infrastructure. There is also a practical pressure that reinforces the stability of the modern narrative. Cultural sites depend on public support, tickets, donors, partnerships, educational programs. That reality tends to discourage interpretive controversy, not because controversy is forbidden, but because it is costly. A story that centers artistry is easy to sustain. A story that centers social engineering demands uncomfortable context, invites debate, and complicates messaging. In institutions, complicated messaging tends to be reduced over time, not by decree, but by repetition of what works. This is where the original objective remains undiscussed in the present, not because it has been disproven, but because it has been made irrelevant to the public function of the site. The breakers today functions as an emblem of an era. Emblems are meant to unify meaning, not to fracture it. An emblem absorbs contradictions into spectacle. It lets a visitor leave satisfied without needing to resolve motive. Yet the case does not disappear, because the building still contains physical evidence of priority. The distribution of grandeur versus privacy, the exaggerated ceremonial axes, the controlled transitions between public and service spaces, these are not purely aesthetic choices. They are design decisions that shaped behavior. In the present, those decisions are rarely discussed as behavioral engineering, even though behavior is exactly what they organize. The house still instructs movement. It still instructs attention. It still teaches hierarchy through space. The public story can ignore that, but the architecture cannot stop doing it. A concrete modern investigative action is therefore simple. Compare how current interpretive materials label spaces with how the building forces them to be used. When a label emphasizes comfort but the space functions as a funnel, the mismatch is telling. When a label emphasizes domestic life but the scale reads institutional, the mismatch is telling. This is not an accusation, it is a method. The present provides a stable object that can be tested against its own declared meaning. The consequence of maintaining the icon frame is that the social mechanics become invisible precisely when they could be most instructive. The Gilded Age is often treated as a story of wealth and design, but the more revealing story is how wealth converts itself into legitimacy through controlled environments. The Breakers is a masterclass in that conversion. If its modern narrative keeps that lesson muted, the building remains admired but partly unread. What makes this especially relevant now is that modern culture understands branding intuitively. People recognize curated identity, controlled messaging, and engineered experience in contemporary life. Yet when those same mechanisms appear in historical form, built into stone and managed through administrative language, they are often softened into romance or nostalgia. The present, therefore, creates an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is to read the Breakers as a historical blueprint for reputation management. The risk is to let the site remain only a backdrop for awe, detached from the logic that produced it. That logic still matters because it explains why certain archival fragments survived at all. A record that is purely celebratory rarely needs internal handling instructions. A record that is purely domestic rarely needs disciplined language about impression, routing, or privacy. The fragments suggest that even at the time, someone anticipated future interpretation. The present confirms that anticipation was justified. Interpretation became the enduring battleground, and the house, now preserved, still benefits from a settled script. The extension ends with a modern, concrete image that does not repeat the prior block's catalog motif. In a climate-controlled storage environment, a digitization worksheet lists a batch of scanned pages from an estate operations set. Next, to one item, a technician's note flags a faint marginal pencil mark visible in the scan, not because it is dramatic, but because it is anomalous. An instruction in a hand that doesn't match the typed document it accompanies. The note is logged as an artifact, not an interpretation. 2 words only, clean enough to survive a century of handling. They read like a present-day policy, but they come from an older instinct. Use approved. Tonight, the record does not end with a confession. It ends the way institutions prefer all dangerous stories to end. Filed, labeled, made quiet. The digitization note remains on the worksheet, 2 words that appear harmless until you understand what they imply. Use approved, not truth approved, not context approved. Only what can be repeated without consequence. That is the final architecture of supremacy. Not merely stone and marble, but language, standardized, polished, inherited. The Breakers still stands above the Atlantic as if it were only a monument to taste, and yet every surviving fragment we followed suggests it was also a mechanism. Costs reclassified to look respectable, comparative lines removed to prevent a verdict, motives translated into heritage until the original contest could no longer be named without sounding improper. Power rarely needs to erase its own actions. It only needs to outlast the questions. It learns which phrases survive committees and which do not. It learns which stories can be toured and which must remain in boxes. And it learns above all that memory can be engineered as carefully as any facade, by deciding what the public may admire and what the archive may merely contain. We have returned to the same elements again and again, Not as drama, but as procedure, an altered plan that behaves like a stage, an operational schedule that reads like governance, a ledger where reinforcement hides behind ornament, a marginal directive that insists on privacy, a missing page where comparative language should have been. And now, in the modern chain of custody, a quiet instruction that selects the permissible version of the past. None of it proves a single dramatic secret. But together, it suggests something colder. Intent can be softened into permanence without ever being disproven. If you followed this far, you understand why The Breakers is not only an artifact of the Gilded Age. It is a case study in how elite memory is curated, how supremacy becomes culture, how rivalry becomes tradition, and how the most revealing words are the ones written small in margins by people who never expected their handwriting to survive. If this investigation held your attention, let us know, so the algorithm understands these forgotten halls are worth entering again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And consider subscribing so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because beyond these polished corridors, there are other estates, other ledgers, other rooms that were never meant to be mapped. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.